Some goodbyes do not need loud tears. They do not need a tragic song, a trembling voice, or anyone announcing that this is the final time. Sometimes, all it takes is one familiar man walking out beneath the studio lights, standing before the desk where he has sat for more than a decade, looking out at an audience applauding a little longer than usual, for everyone in the room to understand that something has truly come to an end. For Stephen Colbert, signing off from The Late Show was not simply the end of a job. It was the moment when a voice that had accompanied America through chaotic nights, bitter elections seasons, media storms, sharp laughter, and moments of stunned silence, finally had to say goodbye to the very place that turned him into a late-night television icon. On the stage of the Ed Sullivan Theater, everything still looked familiar. The lights were still bright. The band was still there. The audience still waited for a clever joke, a raised eyebrow, a perfectly timed turn of phrase that could make the entire room burst into laughter. But this time, behind that laughter, there was something different. It was no longer just entertainment after a long day. It felt like the final applause for an era slowly leaving the screen, not suddenly, but irreversibly. Colbert had stepped into The Late Show with an almost impossible mission: to follow the enormous shadow of David Letterman, to inherit a brand filled with history, memory, and loyal viewers, and somehow make it his own without betraying the soul of what came before. At first, people doubted him. They wondered whether the man who had become famous through political satire on The Colbert Report could truly become the host of a traditional late-night show. They wondered whether he was too sharp, too political, too intellectual, too unpredictable for a stage that demanded a careful balance between comedy and mass appeal. But then history chose him in a strange way. America entered a period when politics no longer stayed neatly inside the evening news. It spilled onto dinner tables, into social media feeds, into arguments between friends, into the exhaustion millions felt every morning before even opening their phones. And in that world, Colbert did not simply tell jokes. He helped people name their exhaustion. He turned confusion into language, anger into rhythm, fear into laughter, sharp enough to keep despair from swallowing it whole. That is why his departure from The Late Show felt heavier than the cancellation of a television program. Viewers were not just losing a host. They were losing a nightly ritual. They were losing the feeling that after every political shock, after every breaking headline, after every public scandal, someone would still be sitting there in a suit, opening with a joke, then patiently unpacking the madness of the world with intelligence, irony, and a kind of compassion he could never fully hide. What made the goodbye even more painful was the way it happened. CBS said it was a financial decision, that the late-night landscape had become more difficult, that costs, viewing habits, and business models were no longer what they used to be. Those explanations may make sense on paper, but audiences do not process loss through balance sheets. For them, it was hard to accept that one of the most recognizable voices on American television could end with a cold explanation about money. And it was even harder because the man standing at the center of that stage was Colbert, someone who had spent years mocking power, questioning media narratives, exposing political contradictions, and then finally leaving under circumstances that made people wonder about the power structures behind television itself. But perhaps that is exactly why his final night felt like more than a farewell. It felt like a reminder. Laughter, when it is deep enough, has never been only laughter. It is one way a society looks at itself. It is where the public finds release when the news becomes too heavy. It is a mirror held up to the powerful, sometimes with elegance, sometimes with sharpness, but always with the belief that truth is still worth saying, even when it is wrapped inside a joke. As Colbert stood there, looking at the audience, maybe he understood that he was not only saying goodbye to a show. He was saying goodbye to a version of America that once sat in front of the television late at night, waiting for a host to help them laugh before going to sleep. And when the lights slowly came down, what made people feel a lump in their throat was not the idea that Stephen Colbert was disappearing. It was the fear that the stage he was leaving behind might never feel the same again. Part 2. Long before Stephen Colbert became the man America turned to at the end of the night, he was not sitting behind the grand desk of The Late Show. He was not introduced by thunderous applause inside the Ed Sullivan Theater. He was not yet the host who would look into the camera and turn the country's confusion into something people could laugh at without feeling foolish for being afraid. Before all of that, he was a performer learning how to weaponize intelligence without losing warmth, a comedian discovering that the sharpest joke is not always the loudest one, and a writer slowly building the voice that would one day define an entire era of late-night television. His rise did not feel like the rise of a manufactured star. It felt more like the slow sharpening of a blade. Every appearance, every segment, every fake serious stare, every perfectly timed pause helped create a comic identity that was unlike anyone else on television. When Colbert appeared on The Daily Show, he was part of a new kind of comedy machine, one that did not simply mock the news, but expose the absurdity hiding inside the way news was packaged, sold, repeated, and performed. He was not just telling viewers what was ridiculous. He was showing them how ridiculousness had become part of the system itself. That was the beginning of what made him dangerous, in the best possible way. He understood that modern media was not only about information. It was about posture, confidence, branding, outrage, and the theater of certainty. And Colbert could imitate that theater so precisely that the imitation became more revealing than a serious lecture ever could. Then came The Colbert Report, the show that transformed him from a brilliant correspondent into a cultural force. On paper, the idea sounded risky. A fake conservative pundit hosting a fake news commentary program, playing everything completely straight while the audience understood the satire underneath. But Colbert did not play the character as a simple clown. That was the genius of it. He made the character confident, patriotic, insecure, theatrical, vain, wounded, aggressive, needy, and strangely lovable all at once. He created a man who believed he was always right, and in doing so, he exposed a media culture built around people who could never admit they were wrong. Night after night, the joke worked because it was more than a joke. It was a diagnosis. Viewers laughed at the character, but they also recognized the real voices he was echoing. They recognized the pundits who sold certainty as truth, the politicians who turned fear into loyalty, the networks that treated conflict like oxygen, and the audiences trained to choose emotion before evidence. Colbert gave that entire ecosystem a face, a vocabulary, and a ridiculous amount of fake self-importance. And somehow, while hiding behind the mask, the real Stephen Colbert became clearer. The more outrageous the character became, the more obvious it was that the man playing him cared deeply about language, truth, morality, and the fragile line between comedy and civic responsibility. That is why his move to The Late Show was never just a career change. It was a transformation. He had to step out from behind the character that made him famous and stand before America as himself. For many comedians, that would have been terrifying. For Colbert, it was almost a second debut. The audience had known his brilliance, but now they had to learn his sincerity. They had known his satire, but now they had to meet the man beneath it. At first, the transition was not effortless. Late Show required a different rhythm, a wider audience, celebrity interviews, musical guests, network expectations, and the weight of a franchise that had belonged to David Letterman, one of the most influential figures in the history of late-night television. Colbert had to honor the room without becoming trapped by its ghosts. He had to be funny without hiding completely inside irony. He had to prove that his voice could survive without the armor of a fictional persona. And slowly, he did. The country changed around him, and in that change, Colbert found the version of The Late Show that only he could host. Politics grew louder. Public life became stranger. The line between entertainment and government blurred until reality itself often sounded like satire. Suddenly, the skills he had spent years perfecting were no longer niche. They were necessary. His monologues became more than opening jokes. They became nightly acts of translation. He took the chaos of headlines and gave them structure. He took the anger people felt and gave it a release valve. He took the helplessness of watching history unfold in real time and turned it into laughter that still carried weight. That is what made his presence so powerful. Colbert was never merely reacting to the news. He was helping millions of viewers survive it emotionally. Beneath the polished timing and sharp punchlines was a man who understood grief, faith, fear, absurdity, and resilience. He knew that comedy could be an escape, but he also knew it could be a form of endurance. And by the time he became one of the defining voices of late-night television, his journey had already become something larger than ambition. It was the story of a performer who began by pretending to be a caricature of power, then ended up becoming one of the few people willing to laugh directly in power's face. What made the ending of The Late Show so difficult to accept was not simply that a television program had reached its final chapter. Shows end, hosts move on, networks change strategies, audiences evolve. In television, nothing is truly permanent, no matter how familiar it becomes. But this ending felt different, because it arrived with the cold language of corporate necessity, attached to something millions of people experienced emotionally. CBS called it a financial decision, a response to a challenging late-night environment, and from a business perspective, that explanation was not impossible to understand. Traditional television had been shrinking for years. Advertising dollars had moved elsewhere. Younger viewers were no longer waiting until 11:35 at night to hear one man explain the day to them. They were watching clips the next morning, scrolling through highlights on social media, listening to podcasts, or getting comedy in fragments rather than full episodes. Late-night television had once been a ritual, but by the time Colbert's final season arrived, ritual itself had become harder to monetize. The problem was that audiences do not grieve like executives calculate. To a network, a show can become a line item. To viewers, it can become part of the architecture of their lives. And that is why the explanation, even if financially logical, landed with such a hollow sound. People were not only hearing that a show was too expensive. They were hearing that a cultural space they trusted no longer justified its own survival. For years, Colbert's Late Show had represented more than celebrity interviews and monologues. It was one of the few places on mainstream television where comedy still tried to wrestle directly with power. It did not always comfort everyone. It did not try to please every political tribe. But it had a point of view, and in a media world increasingly afraid of alienating anyone, that point of view gave the show its identity. Colbert's desk became a kind of nightly witness stand. The headlines came in, the jokes were sharpened, the audience laughed, and somewhere inside that laughter was a quiet recognition that the world had become almost too absurd to process plainly. So when the announcement came, the public reaction was not just sadness. It was suspicion. The timing was too sharp for many people to ignore. Colbert had recently criticized Paramount, CBS's parent company, over its settlement with Donald Trump, using the kind of blunt, comic language that made headlines immediately. At the same time, Paramount was moving through a high-stakes corporate environment, with mergers, regulatory pressure, political scrutiny, and enormous business interests hanging over the company's future. CBS insisted that the decision had nothing to do with content, performance, or politics. But in the court of public emotion, insistence is not the same as trust. Viewers had spent years watching Colbert explain how power often hides behind polite language, how institutions rarely say the uncomfortable part out loud, and how money, politics, and media can become tangled in ways that are difficult to prove, but impossible not to notice. Now suddenly, his own show seemed to be caught inside the kind of story he would have once dissected from behind the desk. That irony was impossible to miss. It was almost too perfect, too bitter, too painfully Colbertian. A comedian who made a career out of exposing contradictions was now standing at the center of one. On paper, the network was making a business decision. In the public imagination, a sharper question remained. Why this show? Why now? And why did it feel like the end of more than a budget problem? That question did not need a definitive answer to carry weight. Sometimes the emotional truth of an event lives not in what can be proven, but in what the moment reveals about the system around it. The death of a late-night franchise exposed the fragility of the entire format. It showed that even a beloved host, even a recognizable brand, Even a show with cultural relevance could still be vulnerable when the economics shifted and corporate priorities changed. And for Colbert, that must have been the cruelest part. He had spent years giving meaning to chaos, but the ending of his own show arrived through a kind of chaos he could not joke away. He could make fun of it, of course. He could raise an eyebrow, cut through the absurdity, and give the audience one last laugh at the expense of the people upstairs. But behind the joke was a harder truth. The machine that had given him the stage could also take it away. That is the sadness hidden beneath the final applause. Colbert did not lose his talent. He did not lose his voice. He did not lose the audience's affection. What he lost was the institution that had carried that voice into American homes night after night. And when an institution disappears, the grief is different. It is not only about one person leaving. It is about realizing that the world which made room for that person may no longer exist in the same form. The Late Show did not end because people suddenly forgot how to laugh. It ended because the business of laughter changed. The audience fragmented, the money moved, the industry hardened, and the kind of television that once felt untouchable became another fragile object inside a corporate spreadsheet. That is what made Stephen Colbert's goodbye so painful to watch. It was not just a host signing off. It was a reminder that even the loudest applause in the room cannot always save the thing people love. The hardest part of watching Stephen Colbert say goodbye was not the idea that a famous host was leaving a famous show. Television has trained people to expect exits. Contracts end, formats change, networks rebrand, and even the most familiar faces eventually step away from the desk. What made Colbert's final stretch feel different was the strange emotional contradiction at the center of it. He still had to make people laugh while standing inside the slow collapse of the very room that had carried his voice for years. Every night, the job remained the same. The audience arrived expecting release. The band played, the cameras moved, the applause sign glowed, the monologue began, the jokes had to land, the interviews had to flow, the room had to feel alive. But beneath the surface, everyone knew the clock was running. Each episode was not just another episode. It was one fewer night left, one fewer opening joke, one fewer exchange with the band, one fewer chance to look into the camera and make sense of a country that often seemed determined to become more absurd than satire itself. That is a peculiar kind of pressure, because late-night television depends on ease. It depends on the illusion that the host is relaxed, spontaneous, unshaken, ready to turn any disaster into a punchline before the first commercial break. But there is nothing easy about performing normalcy while saying goodbye. Colbert had spent years mastering the art of controlled emotion. He knew how to let sincerity into the room without drowning the comedy. He knew when to pause, when to smile, when to sharpen his voice, when to soften it. He understood that the audience did not come to him only for jokes. They came for calibration. They came to feel that somebody else had seen the same headlines, felt the same disbelief, and found a way to keep breathing through it. That made his final nights more than entertainment. They became a test of composure. How do you keep being the person people lean on when the platform beneath you is disappearing? How do you turn the loss of your own show into something generous enough for the audience to survive? The answer, in Colbert's case, seemed to be gratitude. Not the thin, polished gratitude of a farewell speech written by a publicist, but the deeper gratitude of a performer who knows exactly how rare it is to be given a stage, a team, a city, a theater, and an audience willing to meet him night after night. That gratitude mattered because The Late Show was never only Colbert. It was writers shaping chaos into language before the sun went down. It was producers making impossible deadlines look routine. It was camera operators, musicians, researchers, editors, stagehands, bookers, assistants, makeup artists, security staff, and countless people whose names most viewers never learned. A late-night show can make one person look effortless only because an entire invisible machine is working at full speed behind him. And when a show ends, that machine does not simply vanish as an abstract concept. People lose routines, teams scatter, inside jokes become memories. Hallways that once carried panic, laughter, revisions, and last-minute changes suddenly become quiet. That is the part audiences rarely see, but it is the part that makes a farewell so heavy. Colbert was not just leaving a desk. He was leaving a community built around the impossible promise of making something new every single night. And maybe that is why the ending felt so personal, even for viewers who had never set foot in the Ed Sullivan Theater. They understood the feeling of losing a place that held a version of themselves. They understood what it means when a workplace, a ritual, a relationship, or a chapter of life ends before the heart is ready. Colbert's goodbye became a mirror for that kind of loss. It reminded people that even joyful places are temporary, that even successful chapters can close for reasons beyond talent or devotion, and that sometimes the most painful endings are not caused by failure. They arrive because the world around the thing you love has changed. Through it all, Colbert's greatest strength was that he did not try to pretend the moment was small. He let the audience feel the weight without surrendering completely to sadness. He allowed laughter to sit beside grief, because that had always been his language. The comedy did not erase the ache. It gave the ache somewhere to go. And when he smiled through the applause, when the crowd rose for him, when the room seemed to understand that it was not just applauding one man but thanking an entire era, the scene became difficult to watch for a reason that had nothing to do with spectacle. It was difficult because it was honest. A man who had spent years helping people laugh at uncertainty was now facing uncertainty himself. And in that final turn, Stephen Colbert became not just the host saying goodbye, but the person in front of us all, trying to leave gracefully while the lights were still warm. The end of Stephen Colbert's Late Show was painful because it did not feel like an isolated cancellation. It felt like a warning flare from an entire format struggling to survive. For decades, late-night television had a simple power. It was where America gathered after the day had exhausted itself. The news was over, the house was quieter, the noise of work and politics and public life had softened, and a host appeared on screen to help translate the absurdity of the world into something people could carry into sleep. That ritual once felt almost permanent. Johnny Carson had made it feel elegant. David Letterman had made it feel strange, ironic, and unpredictable. Jay Leno had made it feel broad and dependable. Jon Stewart had made political comedy feel necessary. Stephen Colbert inherited all of those shadows and turned them into something suited for an angrier, more fragmented, more digitally overwhelmed America. But by the time his final chapter arrived, the world that built late night had already changed beneath everyone's feet. The audience was no longer gathered in one place. People did not wait patiently for a full episode. They did not always care who was hosting at 11:35 p.m. They watched a monologue the next morning on YouTube. They saw one sharp joke clipped on TikTok. They listened to a comedian on a podcast while driving. They heard political commentary from independent creators, streamers, newsletters, influencers, and people sitting in bedrooms with microphones who could move faster than any network show. Late-night television was still alive, but it was no longer the center of gravity. It had become one voice among thousands, and that was a devastating change for a format built on the idea of shared attention. Colbert's strength had always been that he could make chaos feel communal. When something strange happened in Washington, when a scandal broke, when the news became too surreal for ordinary language, viewers knew he would be there to shape it into a monologue. But the digital world broke that rhythm. By the time a late-night episode aired, millions had already reacted, joked, argued, memed, clipped, debated, and moved on. The internet did not wait for the host behind the desk. It became its own desk, its own studio, its own audience, and its own punchline machine. That did not make Colbert less brilliant. In some ways, it made his craft even more impressive. He was still trying to bring structure to a culture that no longer wanted to stay still long enough to be structured. He was still doing the old magic inside a new attention economy that rewarded speed over depth, outrage over timing, and constant reaction over carefully built comedy. That is why his goodbye felt so much larger than ratings. It exposed the emotional gap between what audiences say they value and what the business can still afford to protect. People loved the idea of intelligent late-night comedy. They loved the clips, the viral moments, the sharp takedowns, the feeling that someone smart was saying what they were thinking. But love in television does not always translate into enough money, enough live viewers, enough ad revenue, or enough corporate patience. A show can matter culturally and still become difficult financially. It can dominate conversation and still lose ground to the economics of a fractured media system. That is the tragedy hiding inside the numbers. The Late Show did not end because America no longer needed comedy. It ended because the old container for that comedy became too expensive, too slow, and too dependent on habits that had already begun to disappear. And the replacement only made the contrast more painful. When a thoughtful, politically engaged, writer-driven late-night institution gives way to a cheaper, simpler format, the message feels brutally clear. The industry is no longer asking what kind of show can define the culture. It is asking what kind of content can fill the slot without costing too much. That shift is not just a business adjustment. It is a cultural demotion. It says something about what television thinks the night is worth now. Colbert's Late Show belonged to a tradition that believed the final hours of the day could still hold intelligence, mischief, argument, music, grief, absurdity, and moral clarity. It believed that a monologue could be more than filler. It could be a pressure valve. It could be a witness statement. It could be a civic ritual disguised as comedy. But in the new landscape, rituals are hard to maintain. Platforms do not want rituals. They want engagement. Algorithms do not care about legacy. They care about retention. Corporations do not always reward influence if influence does not fit neatly into the revenue model. And so Colbert's exit became the perfect symbol of a painful transition. He was not simply leaving late night. He was leaving at the moment when late night itself seemed unsure what it was supposed to become. Maybe the future will belong to podcasts, streaming specials, online shows, or formats that have not fully emerged yet. Maybe Colbert himself will find another stage, because voices like his do not disappear just because one network turns off the lights. But something about the old ritual has been wounded. The feeling of one host, one desk, one theater, one national conversation at the end of the day may never return in the same form. And that is why the end of The Late Show felt so hard to watch. It was not only Stephen Colbert saying goodbye. It was television admitting, almost against its will, that the night no longer belongs to the people who once defined it. What came after Stephen Colbert may have looked, on the surface, like an ordinary programming change. One show ends, another show takes its place. A network fills a time slot, the schedule continues, the commercials still run, and the machinery of television moves forward as if nothing sacred has been disturbed. But for many viewers, the replacement of The Late Show felt like something colder than transition. It felt like a narrowing of ambition. Colbert had built his version of late night around a demanding idea, that comedy could still think, that laughter could still have a conscience, and that a television monologue could be more than a string of jokes designed to pass the time before bed. His show asked the audience to bring something with them: attention, memory, frustration, political awareness. A willingness to laugh at absurdity without pretending absurdity was harmless. When that kind of show disappears, the question is not only what fills the empty slot. The question is what kind of culture the empty slot now rewards. That is why the aftermath felt so revealing. The void left behind by Colbert was not simply measured in ratings or headlines. It was measured in tone. It was measured in the sudden absence of a voice that had been willing to turn toward discomfort instead of away from it. For years, when public life became ridiculous, Colbert did not retreat into safe vagueness. He named names. He followed the logic of power until it exposed itself. He treated politics not as background noise, but as a force shaping people's daily anxiety. That approach made him beloved by some and resented by others, but it also made him unmistakable. There was no confusion about what kind of comic space he occupied. His show had edges. It had moral weather. It had the nerve to suggest that laughter without perspective can become empty, and that entertainment without memory can become surrender. The sadness of losing that voice became sharper when viewers looked at what television seemed to prefer next. Something cheaper, lighter, less politically charged, easier to package, easier to defend, and easier to separate from the storm outside. There is nothing inherently wrong with simple comedy. People need escape. They need silliness, looseness, jokes that do not require them to relive the news cycle. Not every laugh has to carry civic weight. But the pain was not that another form of comedy existed. The pain was that a show with Colbert's reach, history, and sharpness could be replaced so quickly by a format that seemed to ask less of everyone, less of the network, less of the audience, less of the moment. In that contrast, the ending of The Late Show became a kind of confession. Television was no longer trying to preserve the late-night desk as a place of cultural argument. It was trying to make the time slot manageable, profitable, predictable, less dangerous. And that is where the emotional loss became larger than Colbert himself. For decades, the best late-night hosts were not only entertainers. They were interpreters of national mood. They turned scandal into language, tragedy into communal pause, elections into theater, hypocrisy into punchlines, and celebrity performance into something human enough to watch. They were imperfect, often limited, sometimes too comfortable with their own influence, but at their best, they gave viewers a shared place to process the day. Colbert belonged to that lineage, but he also pushed it into a more openly political age. He understood that neutrality can sometimes become its own kind of performance. He understood that pretending not to see the fire does not make the room less smoky. That was why his monologues often landed with such force. The audience did not feel merely entertained. They felt witnessed. After his departure, the silence around that kind of witnessing became difficult to ignore. Who would speak with that combination of wit and grief? Who would make power look ridiculous without making suffering look trivial? Who would understand that a joke can be both a release and a warning? Those questions mattered because Colbert's appeal had never depended only on being funny. It depended on the trust that there was a mind behind the joke and a heart behind the mind. He could be cutting but not hollow. He could be theatrical but not empty. He could mock the powerful while still sounding wounded by the damage power leaves behind. That balance is rare. It cannot be replaced by a format, a brand, or a new face in the same hour. It has to be earned over years, through repetition, risk, failure, and the strange intimacy of showing up night after night. So when audiences looked at the stage after Colbert, they were not just asking whether the new show would succeed. They were asking whether television still had room for the kind of comedy that refuses to look away. And maybe that is the real heartbreak of this chapter. Stephen Colbert did not leave because his voice had gone quiet. He left while the voice was still strong, still sharp, still needed. The applause had not faded. The affection had not disappeared. The cultural argument had not ended. But the institution around him decided that the argument was no longer worth the cost. That is what makes the goodbye linger. Because when a show ends naturally, people mourn the past. But when a show ends while it still feels necessary, people mourn the future that will never get to happen. In the end, Stephen Colbert's final goodbye to The Late Show was never only about the end of a television program. It was about the strange pain of watching an era close, while the person at the center of it is still standing, still brilliant, still capable of making a room laugh. That is what made the moment so hard to understand emotionally. If Colbert had faded slowly, if the jokes had lost their edge, if the audience had drifted away completely, if the show had become a tired echo of itself, the farewell might have felt inevitable, sad perhaps, but expected. Instead, the goodbye carried a different kind of ache. It felt like a door being shut while the conversation was still unfinished. It felt like someone turning off the lights in a room that still had people inside it. Colbert was not leaving because he had nothing left to say. He was leaving because the world around the show had changed, and the institution that once made space for his voice could no longer, or would no longer, protect that space. That is why the final image lingered. A host at his desk, a theater full of applause, a band that had played through years of joy, anger, disbelief, and exhaustion, a staff whose work lived mostly behind the camera, an audience that understood it, was witnessing not just the ending of a season, but the closing of a cultural ritual. For more than a decade, Colbert had done something deceptively simple. he showed up, night after night, through elections, scandals, crises, absurd headlines, celebrity moments, national grief and political storms. He showed up and tried to turn the noise into meaning. That consistency mattered more than people realized until it was almost gone. Late-night television has always depended on the illusion of ease. But what Colbert offered was not easy. It required attention to the news, sensitivity to the audience, moral judgment, comic timing, emotional control, and the courage to risk alienating people in order to say something that felt true. He did not always please everyone, and he was never trying to. His version of comedy was not designed to float above conflict. It stepped directly into it, sometimes with a grin, sometimes with a blade, sometimes with a sincerity that made the jokes land harder because viewers could feel the concern underneath them. That is why his departure raised a question larger than any network schedule. Where does that kind of comedy go now? If the traditional late-night desk no longer has the same power, if the national audience is fractured into algorithms, podcasts, live streams, short clips, and endless feeds, then who carries the role of the late-night conscience? Maybe the answer is not one person anymore. Maybe the age of a single host helping millions process the day is gone, replaced by 1,000 smaller voices speaking to smaller communities. Maybe that is more democratic. Maybe it is more chaotic. Maybe it gives people more choice but less shared experience. What Colbert's goodbye revealed is that something can become outdated as a business model, while still feeling necessary as a human ritual. People still need laughter at the end of difficult days. They still need someone to say, "Yes, this is absurd. Yes, you are not imagining it. Yes, the powerful deserve to be mocked." Grief and humor can exist in the same breath. That need does not disappear just because a time slot changes. It simply searches for a new home, and perhaps that is the quiet hope inside the sadness. Stephen Colbert may have signed off from The Late Show, but a voice like his does not vanish just because one stage goes dark. The desk may be gone, the franchise may be retired, the nightly ritual may be broken, but the instinct behind it remains. The desire to speak clearly when public life becomes dishonest, to laugh when fear becomes too heavy, to use wit not as an escape from reality, but as a way of surviving it. Still, hope does not erase the loss. There is something irreplaceable about the sight of Colbert in that theater, standing at the intersection of comedy, politics, grief, and performance, knowing that the applause around him was both a celebration and a farewell. The audience was not only thanking him for the jokes, they were thanking him for the nights when the news felt unbearable, and his voice made it feel slightly less lonely. They were thanking him for the intelligence, the anger, the restraint, the ridiculousness, the faith in language, the belief that truth could still be smuggled into a punchline. And as the final seconds slipped away, the question was no longer whether Stephen Colbert had mattered. That had already been answered by the room, by the standing ovation, by the millions who felt the goodbye in a place deeper than nostalgia. The question was, what happens after a culture loses one of the places where it used to gather to laugh at itself? Maybe the next stage will be smaller. Maybe it will be online. Maybe it will not look like late night at all. But when Colbert signed off, he left behind more than an empty chair. He left behind a challenge. If the old institutions no longer protect sharp, thoughtful, fearless comedy, then someone else will have to build a place where it can survive. And until that place fully appears, the silence after his final applause will keep echoing.